December 22, 1902. The first group of Korean immigrants boards the SS Gaelic in Incheon, Korea. Their destination, Honolulu, Hawaii, there to become workers in the sugar plantations. They were mostly young people seeking their fortunes. Yes, there was the excitement of travel, adventure, and opportunity, but also there was the fear of the unknown and worry about loved ones left behind.
2 weeks have passed since we left Korea. We are tired, afraid, and anxious about the future. We miss our families so much. Those whom we left behind in Korea, we can't talk to them anymore. It's just terrible. My brothers look tired too. Some are suffering from seasickness, others from the food. How far do we have left to go?
After stopping at Nagasaki, they sailed for another 11 days and finally arrived at Honolulu Harbor. The date was January 13th, 1903. Hawaii was not a paradise for the new Korean immigrants. They soon felt the shock of dealing with an alien culture, the language barrier, the racial discrimination. Their new world was not the beautiful tropical beaches, but the harsh reality of the sugarcane plantation and its back-breaking labor. The dream of the immigrants quickly turned to dust. They thought they would find prosperity in America, but instead they were paid low wages for working 10 hours a day in the grueling sun. Their hearts had been set on returning to Korea, on getting married and living good lives back home. But that dream too seemed impossible now. To address this crisis of morale among the Korean workers, the plantation owners initiated the Picture Bride program. The idea was to secure wives from Korea for these laborers through an exchange of photographs. 1,100 courageous and adventurous young women made the journey to Honolulu, but their story is one of hardship right from the beginning. They had to work side by side with the men in the sugarcane fields, doing work that was every bit as physically demanding as the men. All this in addition to raising children and making a home. In the midst of that trying and difficult situation, the Methodist Church emerged as the place where Korean people could turn for rest, renewal, and hope. There, they could share their struggles and receive comfort from knowing that Jesus Christ was walking with them in their trials and tribulations, that he was able to strengthen them and see them through any and all circumstances. The Methodist connection started in Korea with American Methodist missionaries like George Heber Jones. Jones helped spread the gospel in Korea and served as pastor of United Methodist Church in Incheon. Perhaps unaware of the brutal realities of the cane fields, he agreed to recruit volunteers for work in Hawaii from among the members of his own church. And so it was that 50 of the first 102 immigrants were strong Methodist Christians before they left Korea.
They start having prayer meeting and worship service every day on the boat. By the time they landed at Honolulu, the member grew to 58. So actually that's the first Korean Methodist congregation formed on the boat of SS Gaelic. So we should actually recognize that fact.
The first immigrants who arrived on the SS Gaelic were sent to the Wailua sugar plantation. The next group that arrived on March 3, 1903, were sent to the plantation at Kahuku. These two groups began to worship together, forming the Kahuku Wailua Korean Mission. New groups of immigrants were arriving from Korea every month, more than 8,000 people in less than 3 years. As they arrived, they were sent to different sugar plantations on various Hawaiian islands. And in almost every case, there was a small group of Methodist Christians who organized worship gatherings. These groups were led by local preachers or lay leaders who had been Methodist Christians in Korea. Some Koreans decided to leave the plantations and take their chances in the city. In November of 1903, Chung Soo-an and Pyeng Kil-woo organized a group that began worshiping in a small rented room in downtown Honolulu. The growth was rapid. Within 1 month, the Evangelical Society had to move to a larger house. In April of 1905, they were granted regular church status by the Hawaii Methodist Mission Superintendent. Honolulu's first Korean Methodist Church established the Korean boarding school for boys and created the Korean compound on Punchbowl Street, the center of life for many Korean immigrants in Honolulu. They also published a regular newsletter, which was distributed throughout the Korean community. In 1910, the Japanese annexed and occupied Korea, breaking the hearts of Korean immigrants in America. First Korean Methodist, along with other churches, became the focal point for the Korean resistance activities. For Korean Americans, the church has always been much more than a place to attend worship services. It was and is a place where practical help with daily living can be found, a place to learn English, or where one's children can be taught Korean. It is where community events are held, and Korean culture is celebrated, where news from Korea is shared. In the 1960s, First Korean Methodist changed its name to Christ United Methodist Church. But across a century of service, Christ Church has stood as the mother church of Korean American Methodism. Over the years, some of the original Korean immigrants moved from Hawaii to the mainland of America. They moved to major cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York. But wherever they settled, the church continued to be the center of their lives. In each of those cities, the Methodist Church was the first Christian denomination to serve the needs of the Korean people. The story of Korean immigration is a key part of Methodist Church history because in Hawaii, the Korean immigrants reinvigorated the Methodist movement. By the time the first session of the Hawaii Mission was held, 64% of all Methodists in Hawaii were Korean. There was 1 Caucasian church, 11 Japanese churches, and 19 Korean churches. Among the 945 Methodists in Hawaii, 605 were Korean. We are proud to be the first Son Church of the Korean community. We are proud of our contributions to the Korean community, to America, and to the United Methodist Church.